Well, I've got to jump in at this point, and it's kind of unfair because you gave an answer to a question I haven't asked yet, and that is by suggesting, when David writes, "The heavens declare the glory of God," he writes it in a songbook first. So your connection between science and praise, I think, is more than valid, and it's refreshing answer. So I'm going to ask you a difficult question then, based on some of the language you've used hitherto in our conversation, and that is, when referring to the Big Bang, you were careful to say when time began in this universe, and then again when you said a comment about the universe or multiverse. So my question begins with that. There's a famous apologist who has resurrected a philosophical argument from some medieval Muslim philosophers, and much of at least Western apologetics now is enamored with the idea of using the Kalam cosmological argument to reach out to the atheists as proof of God, or as at least evidence that God exists. My question to you then is, because you seem like somebody who's open to multiverse, and I think that's very humbling, and also the idea of exoplanets might someday, if someday we get a glimpse beyond the curtain and realize that there have been that there is a multiverse, or that we find life on another planet, it doesn't seem like that would hamper your faith. However, do you think it's a mistake when an apologetic for a metaphysical argument is built on physical foundations? In other words, is that, in your opinion, possibly a category error to build an argument on something that might fail in 100 years?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I think it's a little bit risky to build an argument for God based on our current scientific understanding of the natural world, because our current scientific understanding of the natural world can change drastically. I just think about in the last century, we've gone from understanding that everything has a kind of what we call a Newtonian kind of cause and effect, prescribed physical progression, in the sense that everything kind of must be therefore kind of predetermined, because everything is simply reacting to some force before it from the beginning of time, to something that kind of blew our minds when the quantum nature of the physical world we became aware of that in the 20th century. So quantum mechanics basically turned physics upside down, and we now know that uncertainty is basically one of the very building blocks of nature. No one would have predicted that before. So when I hear people kind of building a kind of proof of God kind of argument on things that seem very clear right now, I do get a little uncomfortable. So a lot of times Christians want to parallel the Big Bang cosmology of the universe as a kind of a proof for the truth of Scripture. Now, that might throw some people who may think that Big Bang cosmology is at odds with Scripture. But in fact, the idea that our universe had a beginning was controversial in the scientific community about a century ago. There were some who really held that the steady state theory was a much better theory, both scientifically, that the universe basically had always been here, but also philosophically, because if the universe had always been here, you didn't have to have the kind of theological implications that you could have if the universe has had a beginning. And yet, as the evidence has piled in through astronomical observations and other types of science, it became more and more clear in the early decades of the 20th century that scientifically speaking, the universe that we live in seems to have had a fantastic beginning, which the doubters of that idea call the Big Bang, this Big Bang theory. But in fact, it turns out that this idea that our universe did have a kind of dramatic beginning is more consistent with what we're observing, and that the universe has developed and changed since then over billions of years is very clear through observations of astronomy as well as observations of what's happened on our own planet over the last few of those billions of years. So now, that idea of a beginning of a universe is now kind of seen more on the side of lending itself parallels to a biblical story of the universe having a beginning, and a dramatic one at that, in parallel with the kind of let there be light story in Genesis. So in keeping with that, many Christians now use our understanding of what we call Big Bang cosmology, that our universe had a beginning and that it's developed over time, as a parallel to what we see in Genesis, notwithstanding that the timeline of creation, according to the Big Bang theory, takes lots of time, that the days of Genesis should not be interpreted as literal days. But Christians kind of use this as an apologetic. And I do too, to some extent, because it is very intriguing to me that the days of the literature of Genesis, which weren't meant to be scientific discussions of the details of creation, but nevertheless the days of creation somewhat parallel the progression that we see scientifically in the development of light and of energy and of matter and eventually of stars and planets and life. And in fact, there are some Christians in science who look at that very carefully. They have a kind of day-age view of Genesis and see those parallels very strongly. Hugh Ross is someone who looks at this as a Christian astrophysicist. But I'm concerned when we make too close of a parallel that way, because just as you said, scientific theories change. And I don't believe those original scriptures were actually meant by God to be, to kind of wrap us into a certain scientific view of the universe, and that science can then be used to be an apologetic back to kind of prove the truth of Scripture and the truth of God. Because there's so many surprises. And I think, for example, of fine-tuning arguments. Many people use the argument that our universe has very precise ranges for fundamental constants, like how strong is gravity, how strong is electricity. These kinds of things, the electrical forces, the gravitational forces, they must have been within certain ranges in order for the universe to develop as it has over billions of years, to the point where it could have stars that form and generate these heavier elements that can enable planets to form, that enable stability over long periods of time, so that life itself, advanced life like us, can form and thrive. That's all dependent on having these fundamental constants of the universe being very precise. The speed of light, the strength of gravity, these kinds of things. If it were any different, then we would not have a universe that's habitable. People use that as an argument for God. Although, I'm intrigued by fine-tuning arguments, but I'm also a bit concerned that if we take them too seriously as kind of the proof of God, then when we find out that maybe through future research, that maybe those fundamental constants don't have to be so finely tuned for us to end up with a universe like we have, well then where does that go as a proof of God? I'm intrigued by fine-tuning, but it's not something that my faith depends on. I had faith in God before I learned anything about fine-tuning. So fine-tuning and the arguments from nature, I think, are not good proofs for God. However, I do think there's some strength in looking at complementarity. Which kinds of frameworks of nature are more, and which views of whether or not there is purpose make more sense together, which are more compatible. And to me, when I do look at the natural world, I can't answer all the complicated questions about it, but it is more synergistic with a view of purpose and purposeful creation than with purposeless creation. As I look at the universe as a whole and I see the physical development of the universe that leads toward a universe that can support advanced life, that can ask the kinds of questions that we're having, that can even posit the existence of God, and for some of us feel like we actually can have a personal relationship with God, that is much more, makes more sense to me with a universe of purpose than a universe that has had no purpose. Yet that's a philosophical conclusion. I can't conclude that or prove that kind of conclusion through scientific tools, but I can show how, at least for me, certain models of both science and theology make more sense and are more compatible than others. And I think it's that synergy, it's the holistic picture, what makes more sense as a whole in terms of looking at both the science and the faith questions, that are powerful arguments to me, more than trying to prove the existence of God or prove one's faith through a particular scientific model that may change as our science changes. I would say that for me personally, that the compatibility of kind of the big picture is what keeps me convinced of the truth of Christian faith, because it isn't the case that I don't have any questions or troubles with some of the elements of the faith or scripture. I'm troubled, for example, why would God enable a universe where innocent people and even innocent animals seem to be the brunt of suffering? That doesn't seem to be compatible with other things that I understand about the nature of God as revealed in scripture. I'm troubled by the way people treat one another sometimes. And of course we all should be in some sense. How does that fit in? And yet, when I look at the scriptural revelations as a whole, I see that even the darker parts of human nature are revealed and acknowledged in Scripture. And in fact, God hates what is painful. God does not like death. Even though death is part of the natural order of things, there's a reason why we grieve and suffer. God isn't really pleased with death in terms of removing us from relationship with one another. And that is why the resurrection of Jesus Christ is such an amazing and important miracle. It shows that God himself cares about the things that trouble us, and that the picture that is revealed to us in the Christian faith as a whole of human need for a relationship with God, of human sin, and our ability both in community and as individuals to be selfish, to be cruel, and to do evil things is very real, and that suffering is very real. And yet God recognizes that and has provided us a hope out of that in the future. So all of that meshes with the reality of life that I see around me, and is what kind of convinces me over and over again of the truth revealed in the gospel as a whole, even though I may not always understand, and I have many qualms with some of the particular elements within the faith, within scriptures and so forth. That's kind of how I see a realistic, robust faith at the level of Christianity. And then I think that's kind of how we should see creation as a whole. As we look at the big picture, does it mesh more with a picture of purpose or with a picture of no purpose? And to me, when I look at the history of the universe as a whole and its development to be able to support advanced life through the majestic development of galaxies and stars, that to me is a picture that's more compatible with a picture of purpose than no purpose, philosophically speaking. even though may have some specific qualms and questions about some of the details of what's happened over the history of creation and the universe.